March 15th, 1945, 3:47 in the morning. The wind cuts through the barbed wire of Granada Relocation Center like a blade through silence, carrying with it the scent of sage and the metallic taste of snow that hasn't yet decided to fall. In the dim, pre-dawn light, Kenji Nakamura presses his face against the cold glass of his barrack window, watching electrical lines snap and dance in the storm like broken marionette strings. The power grid serving both the internment camp and the adjacent Southern Ute Reservation has just died, plunging 7,000 souls into darkness. But in this moment of complete electrical failure, an impossible collaboration is about to begin. What should have been a simple infrastructure problem will become something else entirely. A mistake that changes everything. An error that lights up more than just buildings. In war, enemies are supposed to remain enemies. The lines are drawn with mathematical precision. You are either with us or against us, friend or foe, loyal or treacherous. But sometimes, shared suffering creates unexpected alliances that transcend the artificial boundaries that politics draws across human hearts. Sometimes, the very systems designed to keep people apart reveal their absurdity when faced with basic human needs. Like electricity, like warmth, like dignity. This is the story of how a power outage exposed the madness of maintaining hatred while sharing the same harsh Colorado wind, the same bitter cold, the same desperate need for light in the darkness. It's about what happens when human ingenuity meets human compassion in a place where both were supposed to be impossible. Granada Relocation Center sits on the high plains of southeastern Colorado like a geometric scar on an endless landscape. 7,500 Japanese Americans live behind barbed wire, labeled as potential threats to national security by a government that seized their businesses, their homes, their freedom in the name of wartime necessity. Just beyond the fence, the Southern Ute Reservation stretches toward the horizon, home to a people who have watched wave after wave of newcomers claim their ancestral lands while relegating them to increasingly smaller parcels of earth that nobody else wanted. Two marginalized communities, separated by a fence but connected by the same electrical grid, the same harsh weather, the same experience of being treated as second-class citizens in the country they call home. The bureaucratic logic that keeps these communities separate is as rigid as the barbed wire between them. Military regulations prohibit fraternization between internees and local populations. Racial policies assume that Japanese Americans pose security risks that require constant surveillance. Administrative boundaries maintain that government resources should flow through proper channels to appropriate recipients as determined by federal officials who have never set foot on these windswept plains. The power company serves both communities through the same infrastructure while carefully maintaining separate billing systems, separate service records, separate treatment protocols that reflect the federal government's determination to keep different groups of undesirable populations properly categorized and controlled. But infrastructure has its own logic, indifferent to human prejudices. When the storm hits, electricity fails everywhere equally, without regard to race, citizenship status, or federal classification systems. The meeting happens through the fence on the morning after the storm, when both communities are assessing damage and wondering how long they'll remain in darkness. Ayana Whitehawk, a 32-year-old Ute woman who works as a liaison with various government agencies, has come to examine the downed power lines that serve the reservation school. She speaks 3 languages fluently and understands bureaucracy with the bitter expertise that comes from years of navigating federal Indian policy. On the other side of the fence, Kenji Nakamura surveys the same damage with the trained eye of an electrical engineer who designed power systems for Los Angeles before executive. Order 9066 transformed him from a respected professional into a suspected enemy alien. Their conversation begins with practical observations about voltage requirements and transformer capacity, but evolves into something more complex as they realize they're looking at the same problem from opposite sides of the same fence. The recognition dawns slowly. They're both outsiders in their own country, both dependent on the same failing infrastructure, both forgotten by the same government that claims to represent their interests. Kenji's proposal sounds impossible at first. Use materials available in the camp to build a wind turbine that could provide supplemental power to both communities. He has the engineering knowledge, gained from a Berkeley degree, and 10 years of professional experience before the war changed everything. He understands wind patterns, having grown up on a farm in California's Central Valley where his father experimented with various mechanical solutions to agricultural challenges. He recognizes that the constant Colorado wind represents untapped energy, flowing freely across both sides of the fence without regard to the political boundaries that divide the communities below. But materials are scarce. Official permission is impossible, and the project would require collaboration across barriers that military regulations explicitly forbid. Ayana listens with the skepticism of someone who has heard many promises from government representatives over the years. But she also recognizes the practical value of Kenji's technical knowledge and the desperate need for reliable electricity on the reservation where children study by kerosene light and medical. Equipment sits useless when the grid fails. The project begins with quiet conversations and careful planning. Marcus O'Connor, a guard from Irish Boston who has grown increasingly uncomfortable with the moral contradictions of his job, begins looking the other way when certain materials disappear from camp inventories. Elena Rodriguez, a camp administrator whose Mexican-American family knows something about being treated as perpetual foreigners in their own homeland, discovers that requisition forms can be misfiled and certain activities can go unrecorded if nobody asks too many questions. David Standing Bear, an elder from the Ute community who remembers when his grandmother told stories about cooperation between different tribes during hard winters, quietly encourages younger tribal members to share their knowledge of local wind patterns and seasonal weather changes with their neighbors behind the fence. None of these people set out to challenge federal policy or military regulations. They simply recognize a practical problem that requires practical solutions, and they discover that human needs transcend the artificial categories that bureaucracy imposes on human relationships. The construction happens under cover of darkness and legitimate maintenance activities. Camp workshops that officially repair furniture and equipment begin producing components for wind generation systems. Metal scraps from kitchen renovations become turbine blades designed with Japanese precision and informed by Ute knowledge of how wind behaves differently in various seasons and weather conditions. Young people from both communities, supposedly separated by unbridgeable cultural and security barriers, find themselves working together on a project that requires them to combine different types of expertise and different ways of understanding how natural forces can be harnessed for human benefit. The work creates its own small culture of cooperation, where communication happens through shared purpose rather than shared language, where trust develops through competence rather than familiarity, where respect grows from recognizing what each person contributes rather than what category they represent in federal classification systems. The testing phase reveals both the potential and the limitations of grassroots engineering undertaken with limited resources and maximum secrecy. Early attempts produce inconsistent power generation, requiring constant adjustments and modifications that draw on both communities' problem-solving traditions. Kenji's theoretical knowledge must accommodate the practical realities of Colorado weather patterns that Ayana understands from a lifetime of experience. The first successful generation of electricity happens on a night in late April when spring winds carry enough force to turn improvised turbine blades at sufficient speed to produce measurable current. The moment when electric lights flicker to life in the reservation school represents more than a technical achievement. It demonstrates that collaboration across supposed enemy lines can produce tangible benefits for both communities, that shared problems can generate shared solutions, when artificial barriers don't prevent human cooperation from operating according to its own natural logic. This small success challenges fundamental assumptions about loyalty, enemy status, and who deserves to benefit from American innovation during wartime. According to official policy, Japanese Americans in internment camps represent potential security threats whose activities require constant monitoring and whose contact with local populations poses risks that justify severe restrictions. According to federal Indian policy, Native American communities represent dependent populations whose needs should be met through proper government channels rather than through unauthorized collaboration with other marginalized groups. But the Wind Turbine project demonstrates that these policies rest on premises that dissolve when tested against practical human needs and capabilities. Enemy aliens prove capable of contributing valuable technical expertise to community welfare. Dependent populations prove capable of sophisticated understanding of local environmental conditions that enhance technical solutions. Collaboration across racial and political boundaries proves capable of producing results that benefit everyone involved without threatening anyone's security or undermining anyone's legitimate authority. The wind turbine's impact extends beyond simple power generation to illuminate the full meaning of electricity as a metaphor for human dignity and community self-determination. In the reservation school, Ute children study arithmetic and history by electric light generated through collaboration with their Japanese American neighbors, learning that knowledge flows across boundaries when artificial barriers don't prevent natural human cooperation. In the medical clinic, equipment that saves lives operates on electricity produced by people who are officially classified as enemy aliens but who demonstrate loyalty to basic human welfare that transcends narrow definitions of patriotism or tribal affiliation. The steady flow of electrical current becomes a daily reminder that technical problems have technical solutions when human ingenuity is allowed to operate without regard to political restrictions. That community needs can be met through community cooperation when federal policies don't prevent neighbors from being neighborly. What strikes everyone involved is how natural the collaboration feels once it begins, how artificial the barriers seem once they're crossed, how much more sense cooperation makes than separation when viewed from the perspective of practical human needs rather than abstract political categories. The wind that powers their turbine recognizes no distinction between internment camp and Indian reservation, between enemy alien and original American, between suspected traitor and dependent ward of the federal government. The electricity they generate flows according to physical laws that operate independently of racial classifications, citizenship status, or military regulations. The children who study by that light, and the patients, whose lives depend on electrically powered medical equipment benefit equally regardless of their official status in federal bureaucratic systems that categorize people according to criteria that prove irrelevant when human welfare is at stake. The bitter irony emerges gradually as the project's success becomes impossible to ignore or suppress. Enemy aliens provide electricity to original Americans, while both groups remain marginalized by the same government that claims to fight for freedom and democracy around the world. The country that interns Japanese Americans for their supposed disloyalty to American values receives demonstrations of American ingenuity and community cooperation from the very people it has labeled as potential threats. The nation that confines Native Americans to reservations, while claiming to protect their welfare, discovers that those communities possess sophisticated knowledge and technical capabilities that complement the professional expertise of educated immigrants whose loyalty has been questioned despite their obvious contributions to American technological development. The wind turbine stands as a monument to the absurdity of policies based on racial prejudice and political paranoia, rather than practical assessment of human capabilities and community needs. Years later, both communities remember the collaboration differently than official history records it. Military reports mention infrastructure improvements undertaken by internee work crews as part of routine camp maintenance activities. Federal Indian Agency documents note power grid modifications that improved service reliability to reservation facilities. But neither bureaucratic system records the human story of how cooperation across supposed enemy lines produced benefits that neither community could have achieved independently. How shared problems generated shared solutions when artificial barriers didn't prevent natural human relationships from developing according to their own logic. The wind turbine becomes part of oral history traditions in both communities, passed down through stories that emphasize what people can accomplish together when they're allowed to focus on what they share rather than what separates them. The structure still stands today, decades after the camps closed and the internees returned to rebuild lives shattered by wartime hysteria, decades after federal policy shifted and Native American communities gained greater control over their own affairs. The turbine blades no longer turn. The electrical components have long since been replaced by modern power systems, but the framework remains as a testament to what becomes possible when human ingenuity meets human compassion in places where both were supposed to be impossible. Visitors who know the history recognize it as evidence that cooperation transcends the artificial boundaries that politics draws across human hearts. That shared suffering can generate shared solutions when artificial barriers don't prevent neighbors from being neighborly. That the very systems designed to keep people apart sometimes reveal their absurdity when faced with basic human needs like electricity, warmth, and dignity. If stories like this remind you that light can emerge from the darkest places, that humanity transcends the categories that divide us, that cooperation creates possibilities that separation destroys, then perhaps there are other moments in your own experience when artificial barriers dissolved in the face of practical human needs, when supposed enemies became unexpected allies, when shared problems generated shared solutions that benefited everyone involved. The wind still blows across those Colorado plains, indifferent to the political boundaries below, waiting for the next generation to harness its power for purposes that serve human welfare rather than human division.